Hi, in the second video I would like to move from the legal framework to the more socio-legal questions that pertain to what I call migratory vulnerability, or to put it maybe more generally, the question of why migrants, forced migrants especially, are particularly prone to experience a violation of their human rights. Both my article and the podcast with François Crépeau, a law professor at McGill and the former UN Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Migrants, would have gotten you to good answers to the three reading questions that I posed and that were related to this topic. And in general, both of these materials stand sort of in a tradition of works that have been pointing out for quite a while that there is something more fundamental, more structural at stake here, and that there is in fact something that goes to the very heart, to the very ethos of human rights. Which, as we know from the beginning of the course, is of course the idea that every human deserves to be treated in a dignified manner and that the worst excesses of state power should be curtailed as much as possible. So let me answer the first question, which was what is the relation between vulnerability or precarity on the one hand and residency status on the other hand, in reference to arguably the most important thinker in this domain, who is Hannah Arendt. In her 1951 book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, she in fact referred specifically to the fate of refugees, of displaced persons, of stateless people at the time that she was writing and reflecting back on the World War II experience. Stateless people in particular were also a very important part of this group or this problem. In looking at their experiences, she in fact came to the conclusion that the very idea of human rights is misguided, is naive and idealistic, and in fact distracts us from the more general process or sort of phenomenon that people only really enjoy their rights or can only really enjoy their rights within a domestic legal framework, if a state is really willing to afford it to them. Which of course means that it's more about charity and the goodwill of states rather than about an actual rights framework and real entitlements that people can invoke. Now, I don't want to dwell too long on this philosophical idea, although it is a very important one, but I do want to say that what Hannah Arendt called the right to have rights is still very relevant because it points us towards two things. On the one hand, migrants do not have much of a political voice. The degree of their participation is low, which means that if state authorities and if in general the electorate starts mobilizing against them, and in populist times we know that this is very much a possibility, at the end of the day there's very little that they can do politically speaking to prevent their rights being curtailed. But on the other hand, the idea of the right to have rights points us to a sort of correlation between, on the one hand, the degree to which you are an integral part of that political community that Hannah Arendt talks about, and on the other hand, the rights that you get. So Lydia Morris, for example, talks about civic stratification in this context. Fancy word, but what it means or what she wants to describe here is essentially that there is a correlation between the permanency, the security of your resident status on the one hand, and the number of rights that you receive on the other hand. So obviously, as a citizen of a state, you receive all rights, whereas as an undocumented migrant who is not even supposed to be on the territory, you have no rights. And in between, we have a whole spectrum of various different arrangement packages of rights being attached to certain statuses. The more precarious the legal status, the less rights, in effect, one enjoys under the domestic legal system. The issue is that this kind of civic stratification is in fact also visible within the human rights system oneself. It is a part and parcel of it. So if we look, for example, at the European Court of Human Rights, and more specifically at some of the key early judgments that it handed down, for example, in the Mustakim versus Belgium case, it states very clearly that the contracting states concerned to maintain public order, in particular in exercising their right as a matter of well-established international law to control the entry, residence, and expulsion of aliens. And the court goes on to explain that on the basis of this, rights can be limited. Migrants are not entitled, therefore, to receive specific rights such as obviously access to social services and in certain cases even residency in the very first place. Another manifestation of this problem are the so-called non-entrée politics, the politics of non-entry, through which states make sure or are able to make sure that people never get to the jurisdiction, the territorial jurisdiction, where they would be able to claim their rights. And we of course know from debates on migration what is at stake here. So these are the externalization processes, the very reason why barriers are being put up, why people are not able or given the opportunity to enter a state except for making very dangerous crossings, for example, of the Mediterranean. Note in this context that some of the most effective measures of non-entry politics are things that you might even take for granted or don't find particularly problematic, such as visa obligations or indeed carrier sanctions. The idea that it is the carrier, such as the airline, which has to make sure that people don't even enter the plane which would bring them to the territory in which they could, for example, make an asylum claim and, being a refugee, then get all kinds of other rights that are attached to the status. So if there is a general tension between, on the one hand, residency and on the other hand, the human rights that migrants can enjoy, which rights are affected? And this is, of course, what I asked you for the second question. Are social and economic rights also affected? And although there's often an assumption that it's mostly civil and political rights, such as the right to life, the right to physical integrity in the sense of not being subjected or put at risk of inhumane and degrading treatment, even though this is an assumption that this is particularly the main concern for forced migrants, as we can see, obviously, there are social and economic rights that are at stake. Note in this context, for example, that the Refugee Convention of 1951 does establish explicitly a right to housing, explicitly a right to education, explicitly a right to employment within the framework of the surrogate protection that it provides. And we have obviously also in recent years had very heated debates regarding what kind of services migrants are and should be entitled to. For those of you from the Netherlands, you will probably remember the vast cleavages that existed when it came to refused asylum seekers and their entitlements to so-called bed, bath and bread arrangements. So emergency shelter for people whose asylum application did not go through and who saw themselves ended up on the streets, often with their entire families. There are, of course, other manifestations of the same issue. Think back, for example, to earlier weeks, and in one we had an in-class exercise that was dealing specifically with forced domestic labor. So people, often specifically women, who are employed in private households to do domestic work and who, because their residency status is at stake, or sometimes they are indeed without a residency status, are pretty much at the whims, completely at the discretion of their employers who, if they do not like what they are seeing, or if the person does not agree to even very terrible working conditions, threaten to contact the authorities or simply to put the person on the street, where, of course, the risk of them being caught by police, for example, and deported to the country where they came from would be particularly high. I leave it at this, and we'll address the third question regarding the long-term prospects of an improvement of migrant rights to the live session. Obviously, this very much concerned also the opinions that you have or the kind of impressions that you gain from the readings, potentially the podcast. So I also would like to very much hear from you on this point. See you then.